Operation Carpetbagger, dropping OSS cargo for the Resistance, 1944. On a winter night in early 1944, a soft haze settles over eastern England as a cold breeze drifts quietly across the darkened runways of a hidden airfield. Beneath the faint glow of scattered lamps, black-painted B-24s rest in silence, their wings beaded with mist, their engines murmuring in low, steady breaths. The night holds its calm, as if waiting for something unseen to stir beyond the fog. And in that stillness, history gathers its strength. Tonight, we return to these shadowed wartime skies, to a mission flown without fanfare or spotlight, the silent effort known as Operation Carpetbagger. By the closing months of 1943, the war in Europe was entering a turning point shaped not only by advancing armies, but by the countless shadows that moved behind enemy lines. For much of the continent, the years of occupation had created an undercurrent of quiet defiance. Resistance groups in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway had grown from scattered cells into organized networks. They sabotaged railway lines, transmitted coded intelligence, sheltered Allied airmen, and undermined German authority wherever possible. Yet they lacked what every clandestine movement eventually needs: weapons, radios, demolition equipment, medical supplies, and trained operatives capable of coordinating large-scale action. The Allied High Command understood this as 1943 came to an end. Military planners recognized that liberation could not depend solely on conventional offensives. But if the German war machine was to be weakened from within, the underground movements would need direct support, delivered not through front lines, but through the night sky. That realization brought together two organizations that had grown rapidly since the war began: the American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE. Both agencies had been conducting sabotage and espionage in occupied Europe for years, often independently. Their agents operated under cover identities, forged documents, or parachuted into forests and fields under the cover of darkness. But as Allied plans for an eventual return to Western Europe solidified, the OSS and SOE intensified their cooperation. What they needed was a dedicated air arm, a fleet capable of flying deep into hostile territory, alone and unescorted, navigating the night by coastline, moonlight, and the flicker of a signal lamp on a remote hillside. Their supplies would enable resistance groups to disrupt German lines in the months preceding the Allied invasion. From that need, the concept behind what would become Operation Carpetbagger began to form. And in January 1944, the operation officially took shape. Its purpose was clear: to deliver trained agents, specialized commando teams, weapons, explosives, radio sets, and essential supplies directly into the hands of the European resistance. The early focus was France, especially those regions north of the Loire, where the resistance could play a decisive role in the lead-up to Operation Overlord. But as the months passed, the mission expanded outward, supporting movements in Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and other occupied territories. The operation's name, Carpetbagger, drew from an American historical term referring to travelers carrying belongings in makeshift carpet bags after the Civil War. In this context, the name became a code name for a mission that felt equally improvised and equally daring, flying bags of vital supplies across the night and dropping them into a continent strangled by occupation. To carry out this unusual and highly secret role, the U.S. Army Air Forces activated a provisional unit, the 801st Bombardment Group, Heavy. Formed from experienced aviators, including personnel from the 22nd Anti-Submarine Squadron already stationed in Britain, the group was reorganized specifically for nocturnal, low-altitude operations. Later, in August 1944, the group was redesignated as the 492nd Bombardment Group, continuing the mission with the same pilots, the same aircraft, and the same nightly risks. Their early flights originated from RAF Tempsford in Cambridgeshire, an airfield already associated with covert SOE missions. By April 1944, activity shifted to RAF Harrington in Northamptonshire, which soon became synonymous with the operation. The base was modest and deliberately unremarkable, hidden amid farmland and accessed by narrow roads. Few outside the participating units knew what occurred there, but those who served at Harrington would remember the base as a place where day blended quietly into night, where maps of occupied Europe hung under dim lights, and where the hum of engines before midnight signaled the start of another hazardous journey. The aircraft used for these missions were consolidated B-24 Liberators, heavy bombers adapted to an entirely different purpose. Their olive drab was replaced with matte black paint, which absorbed rather than reflected moonlight. The belly turret was removed, creating space for a specially designed hatch known as the Joe Hole, through which agents, nicknamed Joes or Josephines, and containers could be dropped. The aircraft were fitted with specialized navigation aids, including the Rebecca transponder system, which worked in tandem with Eureka beacons operated by resistance groups on the ground. They also carried the S-phone, a short-range radio that allowed direct communication between the aircraft and the reception committees waiting far below. Every alteration reduced weight, noise, or visibility, making the B-24s more suitable for flying close to treetops and rooftops in darkness. Where bombers normally flew thousands of feet above the ground, the Carpetbagger crews typically descended to 400 to 500 feet, sometimes even lower, once inside occupied territory. Such altitudes made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, night fighters, and unseen terrain, yet the lower they flew, the harder it was for radar operators and German listening posts to track them. Timing was equally crucial. Most flights were scheduled on or near nights with bright moonlight, allowing navigators to identify rivers, forests, towns, and field patterns despite blackout conditions. Crews memorized the shapes of coastlines, road junctions, and lakes, knowing that every landmark counted. They crossed the English Channel, descended toward France or the Low Countries, and followed pre-agreed visual cues on the ground. A flash of a lamp held steady for a moment, the glow of a carefully shielded bonfire, or the faint pulsing of an Eureka signal could distinguish a friendly reception committee from a German trap. As aircraft approached their drop zones, communication was minimal. Silence was protection. With the intercom set low and few words exchanged, the crew relied on well-practiced coordination. Pilots adjusted their altitude and speed, navigators leaned over maps illuminated by small red bulbs, and dispatchers prepared the containers, each packed tightly with rifles, Sten guns, grenades, demolition charges, radios, batteries, medical kits, or bundles of clothing. For some flights, a single trained agent would be seated in the aircraft's interior, calm but focused, waiting for the moment to leap into the void. When the aircraft reached the designated point, the dispatcher opened the Joe Hole or the bomb bay and released the load. Containers fitted with static lines deployed their parachutes automatically, drifting into the darkness where shadowy figures below waited to gather them. For agent drops, the procedure required even more precision. A slight miscalculation could put a parachutist in the wrong valley, in a tree, or worse, in the hands of German troops. Entire missions relied on two worlds touching briefly, those in the air and those on the ground, through a few seconds of perfect timing. The secrecy of Carpetbagger flights was so intense that many crew members did not know the identities of the agents they carried, the contents of the containers they dropped, or even the precise towns or villages below them. What they understood was the importance of their task. Their work strengthened resistance networks before and after D-Day, allowing partisans to destroy railway lines, derail trains, ambush convoys, and disrupt German logistics as the Allied armies advanced through France in the summer of 1944. By supporting the French resistance north of the Loire, the crews helped ensure that German reinforcements could not move freely toward Normandy. They also supplied Belgian and Dutch groups who would later assist Allied airborne operations, and Norwegian saboteurs operating in rugged mountains where German garrisons guarded heavy water facilities, rail links, and ports. The drops into Scandinavia were particularly dangerous. Mountains, fjords, unpredictable winds, and long distances over water placed extraordinary strain on the crews and their aircraft, yet they flew night after night. The strategic reasoning behind Operation Carpetbagger was simple but powerful. Every rifle dropped into a French meadow, every radio delivered to a Danish farmhouse, and every trained agent placed quietly behind enemy lines multiplied the Allies' reach. By forcing the Germans to divert troops to guard railways, patrol rural areas, and reinforce communication hubs, the resistance tied down units that might otherwise have fought on the front. It was a form of warfare that sought to fracture the occupation from within, weakening its coherence long before Allied armies could liberate the ground. The risks, however, were immense. Flying alone without escorts, the black B-24s faced night fighters, searchlights, and flak batteries that guarded key transportation routes. Weather frequently complicates matters, obscuring coastlines or masking the signals of reception teams. Some crews returned shaken after lightning storms or swirling fog forced them within yards of treetops. Others did not return at all. Despite the dangers, the men who operated from Harrington and Tempsford continued their work, understanding that their flights, though unheralded and often misunderstood, formed a vital thread in the larger fabric of the war. They flew when the moon rose high, when the winds carried mist across the runway, and when the night seemed impossibly large. They carried with them not only crates and agents, but a quiet sense of purpose. The mission's success depended on the steady courage of crews who never expected recognition, and on the determination of those waiting in the fields below them, ready to retrieve whatever hope the night sky delivered. Night came quietly to RAF Harrington, settling slowly over the runways, the barracks, and the long black silhouettes of the B-24 Liberators resting in formation. As the last traces of daylight withdrew behind the low English hills, a soft mist rose from the fields and drifted across the airfield like a thin veil. Lamps glowed faintly along the perimeter fence, and inside the operations building, the familiar rhythm of preparation began once more. For the crews of the Carpetbagger mission, each sortie started long before the engines turned and the wheels left the ground. It began in a small, dimly lit room where maps were spread across a wooden table and men leaned in to listen. Briefing sessions at Harrington were never dramatic. They were quiet, methodical, and intensely focused, held in rooms kept dark enough to preserve night vision. Crews gathered around their navigator and intelligence officer, studying the route line drawn carefully across the map, the path from Harrington out to the English coast, the crossing over the cold sweep of the Channel, and the low-altitude penetration into occupied territory. The briefing officer updated them on the latest flak concentrations, the reported movements of German night fighters, and the status of reception committees on the ground. Sometimes the intelligence team added notes from escaped agents or intercepted enemy communications. Sometimes they simply repeated what little was known, but there was never any illusion that these flights would be simple. Navigator Eugene Polinsky later recalled that we would have to meet with intelligence before a mission and intelligence after a mission. We'd fly to the English coast, drop down to 500 feet across the Channel. His memory captured the routine yet intense rhythm of the operation, a constant loop of preparation, flight, and debriefing, each cycle shaped by the unpredictable hazards of the night sky. While the crews studied maps, ground personnel outside prepared the aircraft. Each B-24 assigned to carpetbagger duty had undergone a transformation that made it different from the bombers flying daylight raids over Germany. Painted in matte black to minimize reflection in moonlight, the aircraft seemed almost to dissolve into the evening darkness. The belly turret had been removed, leaving space for a hatch known as the Joe Hole, which allowed for the swift release of agents and supply containers. Extra armor and some guns were taken out to reduce weight and allow the aircraft to fly lower and longer. Oxygen systems were minimized, since carpetbaggers would not be climbing to high altitudes. Inside the hangars or at the edge of the runway, metal containers were assembled and packed according to strict guidelines. Each container was built of steel, fitted with padding and a parachute, and labeled according to its contents. Some held Sten guns, rifles, or bazookas. Others carried explosive charges, timing pencils, wire cutters, or radio transmitters. Many contained medical packs, clothing, batteries, currency, intelligence documents, or coded instructions. These containers would drop vertically from the aircraft, their parachutes opening almost immediately after release thanks to static lines attached inside the plane. Every detail mattered. A faulty packing job, a twisted parachute, or a damaged latch could compromise not just a container, but an entire network of resistance fighters waiting for it below. While the containers were loaded, specialists inspected the aircraft's navigation equipment. Among the most important tools was the Rebecca transmitter, designed to detect signals sent by the Eureka beacon operated by resistance groups in the field. When approaching a drop zone, the navigator would watch for the distinctive blip on the receiver, confirming that the coded signal from the ground matched the expected frequency and Morse pattern. If the wrong signal appeared, if there was no Eureka, or if the pattern differed from what had been prearranged, the crew would abort the drop rather than risk delivering supplies to a German trap. Along with Rebecca Eureka, the S-phone system provided short-range voice communication between air and ground, useful only in the final approach, when every second was critical. Reception teams used visual codes as well. 3 torches aligned in a straight row, with a 4th placed perpendicular at a right angle, forming the signal pattern required for a safe drop. In some regions, particularly those with wooded terrain or a greater German patrol presence, the teams lit controlled bonfires instead, shielding the flames to hide them from watchtowers and patrols. Nothing was ever guaranteed. A reception team might be late, disrupted, or intercepted. Even a poorly aligned torch could cause confusion, forcing the pilot to circle again or abandon the run entirely. By the time all preparations were complete, the night had usually deepened into full darkness. Crews walked out to their aircraft with flight jackets zipped high, parachutes strapped in place, and maps folded carefully in their pockets. The Liberators stood ready on the tarmac, their black surfaces glistening faintly under the low lights. As engines started, one by one, the air vibrated with a soft but insistent rumble. Exhaust fumes drifted across the runway. The ground beneath the flight line seemed to tremble. Yet even in this activity, there was no haste. Everything was measured, steady, and deliberate, as if the night itself required a certain respect. Once cleared for departure, the B-24s began to taxi toward the runway. The tires whispered along the concrete, and the aircraft lined up nose to tail. Pilots watched for the signal from the control tower, then advanced the throttles, feeling the aircraft gather speed as it surged forward. The runway lights passed on either side in long, blurred streaks, and with a gentle lift, the Liberator rose into the air. Climbing into the night, the aircraft moved steadily toward the English coastline. The climb was not high, only a few thousand feet, enough to clear local terrain and prepare for the long crossing of the Channel. As they approached the coast, many crews felt the familiar tension that accompanied this transition from relative safety into the uncertain dark beyond. The water below was a cold, rippling void, broken only by a faint reflection of moonlight. Ahead of them stretched enemy territory, guarded by radar posts, flak guns, and the unpredictable presence of night fighters. Crossing the English Channel was done at roughly 6,000 feet. This altitude allowed the crews to avoid coastal anti-aircraft guns that tracked low-flying aircraft, but also kept them below the range of heavier flak batteries further inland. Once over enemy territory, the aircraft descended rapidly, sometimes to as little as 500 feet and occasionally even lower. Flying so close to the ground reduced the radar signature of the aircraft and made interception by German night fighters far more difficult. Yet this advantage came with risks. Unseen hills, church steeples, power lines, and trees loomed in the darkness. In some areas, mist rose from lakes or marshes, obscuring entire valleys. Pilots learned to trust their instincts and instruments, adjusting altitude by the faint outline of a treetop or the sudden shadow of a rising slope. As the aircraft pressed deeper into occupied territory, the soundscape inside the cabin shifted. The engines still hummed with steady power, but with the aircraft flying lower, the rush of wind around the fuselage became more pronounced. Crew members spoke quietly, if at all. A few words, a brief confirmation, a soft adjustment of throttle, these were all that broke the silence. Radio silence remained essential for most of the journey. The Germans maintained listening posts and interception centers along key routes. A single, careless transmission could reveal the aircraft's presence or draw the attention of nearby night fighters. When the navigator announced they were nearing the drop zone, everyone prepared. Pilots steadied their course, bombardiers moved to their stations, and dispatchers double-checked the containers. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air. Through small windows, glimpses of the dark countryside appeared, the faint line of a river, a patch of forest, the angular shadow of a farmhouse. Then, ahead, the navigator watched for the Eureka signal. If the ground team had arrived, a rhythmic pulse would appear on the receiver. Sometimes the signal came quickly, steady and reassuring. Sometimes it flickered, distorted by terrain or weather. Sometimes it never appeared at all. Below, if the reception team had reached the drop zone, 3 torches or a small bonfire would shine through the dark, arranged precisely as instructed. The moment the crew spotted the correct pattern, the pilot descended to the final drop altitude, usually around 400 feet. At this height, the details of the landscape became sharp and immediate. The wind roared past the fuselage. The sound of the engines deepened. Even the smallest bump in the terrain seemed close enough to touch. The dispatcher opened the Joe hole. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the aircraft, carrying with it the scent of damp earth rising from below. Crew members leaned toward the open space. For a brief second, the interior of the aircraft seemed to hold its breath. Then the order came to release. Containers slid downward, their static lines pulling taut and deploying their parachutes instantly. From above, they resembled dark shapes drifting into the night, swallowed by the land beneath. If the mission included an agent drop, the moment became even more solemn. The agent would approach the opening, nod to the dispatcher, and step into the air. It took only a second for the parachute to deploy, but the act itself carried a weight that everyone on board understood. By the time the aircraft turned away, the agent was alone in the darkness, landing in a world where silence and secrecy could mean life or death. Inside the aircraft, after the last container or agent had left, the Joe hole was closed swiftly to restore the internal temperature and reduce wind resistance. Pilots then increased speed, banking away from the drop zone to avoid alerting German patrols to the exact location. In many missions, flak bursts appeared moments after the aircraft departed. German gunners, alerted by the sound of low engines, fired into the night sky in wide arcs, hoping to catch the black aircraft with a lucky shot. But at low altitude and high speed, the B-24s were difficult targets. somewhere behind them, the reception team extinguished torches and hid the containers before dawn. A successful drop gave them hours, not days, to move supplies before German patrols swept through the region. Both the crews in the air and the men and women on the ground relied on these minutes of darkness. Their safety and the mission's success depended on it. With the drop complete, the aircraft climbed gradually to a safer cruising altitude. Not high, just enough to clear unexpected obstacles, conserve fuel, and ease the strain on engines that had been running at low altitude for long stretches. The return journey had its own hazards. German night fighters sometimes patrolled near coastlines, knowing that Allied aircraft returning from clandestine missions tended to follow predictable routes. Searchlights scanned the sky around ports, rivers, and rail junctions. But as the aircraft neared the channel, tension eased slightly. The cold water below served as a silent boundary between danger and safety. Approaching the English coast, the aircraft gained additional altitude. Radar installations dotted the shoreline, and flying higher helped avoid accidental misidentification by Allied ground controllers. Once the crew received clearance from the radio operator at a British listening station, the pilot began the final descent toward Harrington. Landing was always quieter than takeoff. As wheels touched the runway, the deep rumble of the engines softened into a low vibration. The aircraft slowed, rolling through the cool night air, and came to a gentle stop. Crews breathed out slowly, letting tension slip away. Some missions were calm, uneventful, and efficient. Others involved sudden bursts of flak, unexpected storms, or moments when instruments or engines faltered. But each landing brought a familiar relief, the knowledge that for one more night, the crew had returned safely. In some accounts, crews recalled receiving a small ration of cognac after returning. One pilot mentioned, "When we landed, we got cognac to make us talk." The warmth of the drink helped steady their nerves before the debriefing session that followed. Inside the operations building, intelligence officers took notes on what the crew had seen: the presence of enemy searchlights, the pattern of flak bursts, the reliability of the drop zone signal, and the weather conditions encountered along the route. These details shaped the next night's missions and informed the broader strategy of supporting resistance movements across Europe. But not all flights ended with quiet debriefings. Some missions were marked by loss. One of the better-known incidents involved a B-24D named Worry Bird, aircraft number 4240997. On the night of April 27-28, 1944, while flying a mission over France, Worry Bird struck rising ground near Saint-Cyr-de-Valorges in the Loire region. The crash killed several crew members instantly, though a few survived and were rescued by members of the French Maquis. Their survival, though remarkable, underscored the peril inherent in every sortie. Terrain, weather, or a single navigational error could prove fatal when flying at such low altitude under strict blackout conditions. Other crews faced similar dangers. Low-level night flights increased the risk of clipping treetops, hitting unlit towers, or encountering sudden fog banks that left pilots blinded. German anti-aircraft units also adapted, setting up ambushes in areas where they anticipated Allied supply flights. Night fighters prowled the skies, listening for the distinctive engine sound of the liberators. Despite their skill and experience, some crews did not return. By war's end, approximately 25 B-24s had been lost on Carpetbagger missions, and 8 more were damaged beyond repair. Even so, the operation continued night after night, sustained by the determination of the men who flew and the resistance fighters who waited silently in fields and forests. They shared a common understanding that every container dropped, every agent delivered, helped weaken German control from within. Their efforts, though quiet and often overlooked compared to massive land battles, played a vital role in preparing Europe for liberation. For the crews, the memories of these journeys endured long after the war. They remembered the gentle glow of a torch far below, the sudden burst of wind as the Joe hole opened, the hum of the engines at low altitude, and the quiet moments before dawn when the aircraft landed back at Harrington. In these memories, fear and purpose intertwined. They recalled the nights they flew into darkness carrying not just supplies, but the hopes of people fighting without uniforms or front lines. They remembered the solitude of the flights, the constant vigilance, and the sense that the success of their mission depended on a few fragile moments of connection between sky and earth. For the resistance fighters who retrieved the containers, those same moments represented something else entirely. The knowledge that they had not been forgotten, that the world beyond occupied borders had reached out to them, and that the struggle for liberation was shared. The quiet descent of a parachute in the night, the dull thud of a container landing on soft soil, and the hurried footsteps of a reception team carrying supplies to safety were reminders that the war's outcome would not be decided by armies alone. Between the silent fields below and the dark sky above lay the journey of Operation Carpetbagger, a journey measured not just in miles flown, but in bonds formed across the shadows of occupied Europe. Through every sortie, every risk, and every return, the crews at Harrington built a bridge of support that helped sustain the fight for freedom, one night at a time. The decisive moment in a Carpetbagger mission often came in the final minutes before a drop, when the night seemed to hold its breath and the crew waited for the first sign that the reception team below was in place. The aircraft had already flown hundreds of miles in darkness, skimming low over fields and forests, listening to the steady rush of air that pressed against the fuselage. As the navigator checked his watch and the dim glow of his instruments, time narrowed into something slow and deliberate. On certain nights, a thick veil of mist drifted through the valleys, softening the moonlight until it seemed to float in a pale shimmer over the landscape. Inside the cockpit, the glow of red lamps cast long shadows across the controls. The clock read O2:17. Outside, the moon hung full in the sky, filtered by low clouds. Below, the countryside was nearly black, with no street lamps, no lanterns, no hint of life, except the muted shapes of fields divided by faintly visible hedgerows. Then, ahead, 3 small lights appeared, 3 white flashes that flickered in a straight line, followed by a 4th that tilted 90 degrees to form the pattern the crew had rehearsed so many times. It was the sign the reception team had made it. Someone on the ground had arrived early, traveled under curfew, avoided patrols, and now stood exposed, holding a torch in defiance of a guard post they knew could be just beyond the next hill. At that moment, the navigator leaned forward and spoke softly, almost a whisper in the quiet cabin. "Drop in 30 seconds. The pilot brought the aircraft down smoothly but quickly, lowering altitude until the Liberator seemed to slide just above the treetops. From the open hatch, the crew could sometimes see the shadow of a barn or the curved roof of a deserted house passing beneath them. The sound of branches brushing against the slipstream carried upward like a faint whisper, and on particularly low runs, crewmen later recalled hearing the creak of wooden beams as the aircraft's wake stirred the structures below. The Joe hole opened with a metallic clank. A sudden surge of cold air swept into the fuselage, clearing the warmth accumulated during the long flight. The dispatcher leaned out slightly, checking markers on the ground, scanning for any deviation in the signal pattern. The faint gold of the torchlight reflected inside the hatch, trembling like a flame struggling against the wind. Crew members steadied themselves as the aircraft maintained its precise path. The dispatcher checked the final details, altitude, airspeed, and the approach angle. Once everything aligned, he pressed the release. Containers slid downward into the darkness, each guided by a static line. That snapped their parachutes open within a second. Their cloth canopies blossomed like pale flowers against the night sky. drifting toward the waiting hands below. If the mission involved an agent, the tension sharpened even further. The agent stepped forward without hesitation, though the moment held a profound stillness. He would have trained for this leap for months, but training could never entirely capture the cold rush that came with stepping through an open hatch into a land occupied by enemy forces. A quick nod to the dispatcher, a breath, and then he was gone, swallowed by the night. The parachute opened with a muted rustle, and in a few seconds his silhouette faded into the landscape. For the crew watching him disappear, there was always a moment of silence, an acknowledgement that his fate now rested on the quiet coordination between strangers meeting in the dark. Once the final container fell, the dispatcher shouted that the drop was complete. The pilot pulled the Liberator into a tight turn, banking away from the drop zone with a sharp change in speed. In the brief seconds after the turn, the crew often saw the faint flicker of torches being extinguished, the last glow dying as resistance members hurried to hide the supplies before dawn. In that same interval, the aircraft's engines seemed louder, the vibrations sharper, as it accelerated to escape the danger zone. Then came the uncertainty. One never knew how quickly German forces would react. Sometimes, within moments of the turn, the crew heard the faint boom of anti-aircraft shells exploding somewhere in the night behind them. The percussion arrived in soft, delayed thumps, distant but unmistakable. At other times, the crew watched arcs of flak fire reaching upward, searching blindly for the black aircraft now racing away at low altitude. Radar stations near key roads or towns sometimes switched on, casting invisible sweeps across the sky. These were dangers the crew could not see, only hear or sense through the sudden intensifying hum of their instruments. Pilots kept a steady hand on the controls. At such low heights, even small turbulence felt magnified. Trees, hills, and church steeples could appear out of nowhere, especially in patches of fog. One pilot, recalling a night flight into Norway, described a moment when the aircraft struck the top of a tree. He later said, "Our crew made 4 missions to Norway. On one mission, our plane hit a tree, just happy that we didn't hit the trunk of the tree." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of what these missions demanded: precision, calmness, and resilience under conditions that gave little room for error. While the drop itself was the most concentrated moment of risk, the challenges surrounding it were equally daunting. Secrecy, which defined the very nature of the operation, brought complications. Drop zones sometimes changed at the last minute due to resistance movements or German patrol patterns. Weather could transform a straightforward flight into something treacherous. A layer of fog settling unexpectedly over a valley might obscure landmarks, or heavy cloud cover might hide the moon and deprive navigators of vital visual cues. Crews had to make decisions quickly, whether to proceed, hold position, or abandon the drop altogether. Caution was often the only option, though the frustration of returning with undelivered supplies weighed heavily. Ground signals, though carefully prearranged, could prove unreliable. A misplaced torch or a partially obstructed bonfire changed the signal's appearance. In some cases, the Germans deliberately attempted to mimic resistance patterns to lure aircraft into traps. When signals did not match expected positions or timing, confusion spread quickly through the cabin. The crew would circle for a few minutes, hoping the reception team might appear, but sometimes the mission had to be abandoned. Each aborted run meant an increased risk of detection. Each pass extended exposure to anti-aircraft batteries hidden in the countryside. Flying at low altitude during these operations also increased the danger of collisions. The landscape was unpredictable in blackout conditions. Hills rose abruptly, rivers cut through land in ways difficult to see from above. Wooden towers, telephone poles, and factory chimneys, unlit and silent, blended seamlessly into the darkness. And always there was the threat of night fighters. Their approach was often silent until the last moment, when a flash of tracer fire or the sudden jolt of a near miss revealed their presence. Carpetbagger aircraft had few defensive options. Evasion was the only real tactic. A sudden dive, a sharp turn, or a burst of speed might shake an enemy pilot, but the margin for error at such low altitude was thin. Even when routes were familiar, each night brought new challenges. The liberation of France after D-Day eased some aspects of the mission, but it also shifted focus toward more distant and more dangerous regions. Norway and Denmark, with their stark landscapes and unpredictable weather, demanded different flying techniques and increased endurance. Mountains created wind shears that pushed aircraft sideways without warning. Fjords acted as channels for low fog that drifted unpredictably. Crews had to adapt quickly to these conditions, altering altitude or course to avoid sudden hazards. But the limits of the operation also became clear. Carpetbagger flights delivered thousands of containers, but the scale of the European war dwarfed even these efforts. While the resistance benefited enormously from the supplies, the sheer size of the continent meant that only a fraction of groups could receive material support. Each drop represented vital hope for those who received it, but there was no illusion that these missions alone could alter the larger balance of the war. Still, the cumulative effect was real. Broken rail lines, disrupted convoys, downed telegraph wires, and damaged bridges all weakened the German war effort and forced the enemy to deploy more troops for internal security. July 1944 marked the high point of the operation in France. Records show that in that single month, Carpetbagger aircraft dropped at least 4,680 containers, 2,909 packages, 1,378 bundles of leaflets, and 62 agents. The intensity of that period reflected the urgency of supporting the resistance ahead of the Allied advance from Normandy. Each mission was timed to strengthen local action, encourage sabotage, and help sever German supply routes. The coordination between air crews and resistance units became a hallmark of the operation's success. With each drop, communications improved, operational confidence grew, and Allied intelligence deepened. The true climax of the Carpetbagger mission was not marked by explosions or clashes, but by these quiet, fragile connections between sky and ground. It was the moment the pilot saw the faint glow of torches in a field where no lights should be. It was the moment an agent stepped into the darkness, trusting a thin canvas parachute and the waiting strangers below. It was the moment the dispatcher released a container and watched it drift softly toward the earth, carrying weapons or medicines that could mean the difference between survival and defeat for a hidden group of fighters. Carpetbagger sorties became a symbol of a different kind of warfare, one conducted in silence rather than fire, one that depended on trust rather than numbers, one that blurred the line between hope and danger. While daylight bombing missions dominated headlines, these nighttime flights carried out a quieter work, sustaining the will of people who resisted occupation night after night, in valleys and villages marked only by a glimmer of torchlight. And so the climax of the mission was not a single event, but a recurring moment repeated across dozens of landscapes. It was the point where uncertainty peaked, where risk was highest, and where resolve was tested. Every drop carried with it the vulnerability of exposure, the possibility of failure, and the knowledge that the smallest mistake could unravel months of preparation. Yet it also carried the promise of resistance renewed, of lives saved, of sabotage executed, and of the slow, steady weakening of German control across occupied Europe. This delicate intersection of fear and purpose defined the heart of Operation Carpetbagger. The climax was not destruction, but delivery, an act of offering carried out under the watchful silence of the moon in the fragile hours before dawn. Between January 1944 and the spring of 1945, the unit flew roughly 1,960 sorties across Western and Northwestern Europe. During those long nights, nearly 2,495 containers and more than 11,174 packages were delivered to resistance networks operating under occupation. Over 1,000 agents, men and women trained by the OSS, SOE, and Allied intelligence services, parachuted through the Joe Hole into forests, fields, and farmlands where they would begin months of clandestine work. The scale of this quiet effort, carried out far from the sweeping fronts of Normandy or the Ardennes, revealed a different aspect of Allied strategy, a sustained attempt to strengthen the war from within by empowering local fighters in the shadows of their own towns. 25 B-24 aircraft were lost to weather, terrain, flak, or enemy night fighters, and 8 others were damaged beyond repair. Approximately 208 members of the Carpetbagger crews were killed or went missing during the mission's 15 months of operation. The work demanded navigating low altitudes, unpredictable weather, and areas crisscrossed with enemy searchlights and radar. Every sortie carried the risk of a sudden jolt, a flash of tracer fire, or a hill that rose out of the night without warning. Yet despite the danger, the crews continued to fly, sometimes returning from a mission with their wings riddled with holes or their engines struggling, but still pushing forward into the next night. Historians later described Operation Carpetbagger as a precursor to modern special operations aviation, establishing concepts of low-level night flying, precision insertion, and independent clandestine support that would become central to Air Force special tactics long after 1945. The lessons learned from Rebecca Eureka navigation, silent communication, and close coordination with ground teams influenced post-war doctrine for decades. In a conflict best remembered for massive armies and sprawling battles, this was an example of how subtlety, timing, and secrecy could carry weight equal to divisions on the ground. The effect on the war itself was quiet, but meaningful. By reinforcing the resistance, the Allies ensured that German forces were disrupted behind their own lines. Railways were sabotaged more frequently. Bridges collapsed under explosives supplied by these nightly flights, and German supply movements were delayed or fragmented. Troops who might have been sent to reinforce Normandy or the Eastern Front were instead tied down patrolling villages, guarding roads, or chasing shadows across the countryside. Intelligence gathered by the resistance, amplified by the arrival of trained agents, shaped Allied understanding of troop movements and defensive positions. In this sense, Carpetbagger flights served as threads, binding together the internal and external fronts of the war, helping coax weaknesses into the surface just as the main Allied armies advanced. Beyond their strategic value, these flights also altered the way air power was understood. They demonstrated that aircraft could support an underground war with precision and discretion rather than overwhelming force. Not every victory needed fire. Sometimes it needed a container of radios or a bundle of medical supplies or the presence of a single agent stepping into a silent field. The idea that aircrews could deliver hope as effectively as they delivered bombs became a subtle but important shift in the imagined roles of air forces in future conflicts. The human reflection on these missions carries its own quiet weight. In the vastness of wartime skies, the image of a black-painted B-24 gliding through the dark, engines muted against the wind, speaks to a form of courage that is often overshadowed by louder stories. These crews carried no bombs, no heavy armor, no escort fighters. They flew into enemy territory armed mostly with trust that the resistance would be there to receive them, trust that the signal lights on the ground were genuine and not a trap, trust that the moon would hold steady and the clouds would not close in. Theirs was a mission built on fragile alignments, where even a misplaced torch or a moment of miscommunication could shift the outcome entirely. For the resistance fighters waiting below, these flights meant everything. A single drop might supply a rural cell for months, allowing them to repair radios, plan sabotage, and survive the winter. When they saw parachutes floating in the night, they saw not just equipment, but acknowledgement, a reassurance from far away that their struggle mattered. It was as if the darkness itself had opened to let fall a quiet promise that they had not been forgotten. Yet every success carried its shadow. A missed drop could mean a cache falling into German hands. A lost aircraft meant a crew that would not return, families receiving telegrams months later. These failures served as stark reminders of how delicate the balance of resistance could be, and how high the price of freedom often rose in the hidden corners of the war. The silence that followed each loss, whether in a French valley or a Norwegian fjord, added another layer to the human cost of these operations. In the end, the meaning of Operation Carpetbagger extends beyond statistics or strategic outcomes. It speaks to the quiet bravery of individuals who stepped into the night, without knowing whether they would return or whether the lights below them belonged to friends or foes. It reflects the resilience of those on the ground who risked their lives to catch falling canisters before dawn exposed them to danger. And it shows that in war, not all victories are loud. Some are whispered, some drift down on parachutes and vanish into the hands of unseen allies. Some shine only for a moment, in the flicker of a torch held high in a field where hope once seemed too distant to reach. As the engines of the last B-24 wind down, the night settles gently over the runway once more. The moon dips low, and a soft wind moves along the silent wings of the black-painted aircraft that once carried secret cargo across the dark. The men of Operation Carpetbagger step down from the noise and strain of the sky into the quiet of the airfield, their journeys now left drifting over the fields of Europe. And in the stillness, we remember them and the hidden mission that flew hope into the night.